A dimly lit room. Vienna, Austria. September 1939. On a dark wooden desk lies a barely legible letter, written in a trembling hand. The words reveal despair. "I can't take it anymore." The man who wrote it revolutionized our understanding of the human mind, but his own was unraveling. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, faced something more terrible than exile or Nazi persecution: jaw cancer that had tormented him for 16 years. 33 surgeries. The smell of necrotic flesh was so unbearable that even his own dog avoided him. This is the story that never appears in textbooks. The story of the pain behind the genius. We step back decades. The world celebrates its heroes: scientists, artists, thinkers who changed civilization. Their faces adorn postage stamps, their names grace streets and universities. But behind every monument lies an uncomfortable truth that history prefers to forget. These titans didn't just battle ignorance or injustice. They fought invisible enemies: undiagnosed mental illness, hidden addictions, childhood traumas that haunted them to the grave, and the crushing weight of impossible expectations. This is an exploration of what their greatness truly cost them. Not only them, but those around them. The camera roams through museums, libraries, theaters. Masterpieces we admire without question. The Ninth Symphony. The Theory of Relativity. Van Gogh's paintings. But there's a disturbing pattern connecting many of these creators. A documented correlation between creative genius and psychological disorders. Studies from Johns Hopkins University in the 1990s revealed that writers and artists have rates of depression and bipolar disorder up to 20 times higher than the general population. Is suffering the fuel of genius? Or does genius attract suffering? The answer is more complex and darker than we imagine. Germany, 1827. Ludwig van Beethoven lies dying in his Vienna apartment. A thunderstorm shakes the buildings. According to witnesses, in his last moment of consciousness, Beethoven raises his fist to the sky, as if defying fate itself. He dies moments later. He was 56 years old. The autopsy revealed a cirrhotic liver, destroyed kidneys, and a perforated intestine. But Beethoven's most famous tragedy isn't in his internal organs. It's in his ears. By 1819, he was completely deaf. Imagine the torture: being the greatest composer of your time and not being able to hear your own creations. We go back to 1802. Beethoven is 31 years old, and his career is on the rise. But he already senses the terrible truth: he is losing his hearing. In October of that year, in the small town of Heiligenstadt, he writes a heartbreaking letter to his brothers. He will never send it. In it, he confesses to having contemplated suicide. "I almost ended my life," he writes. He describes the humiliation of not being able to hear conversations, of having to ask others to speak louder, of isolating himself socially to hide his defect. What saved Beethoven, in his own words, was art alone. But that art demanded a brutal price: utter solitude, destroyed personal relationships, and a growing anger against a world that never understood his suffering. But deafness wasn't his only torment. Modern investigations of strands of Beethoven's hair, conducted in 2008, revealed lead levels 100 times higher than normal. Chronic lead poisoning would explain his constant abdominal pain, his extreme irritability, and possibly even his deafness. The source? Probably the cheap wine he drank daily, stored in lead-lined containers. Unbeknownst to him, Beethoven was slowly poisoning himself while composing masterpieces. His musical genius flourished precisely as his body chemically disintegrated. This duality, simultaneous creation and destruction, defines the lives we will explore. The camera zooms in on an original Beethoven manuscript. Musical notes scribbled in fury, violent crossouts, ink stains. These documents reveal the chaotic workings of his mind. But a disturbing question arises: would Beethoven have created his most profound music without that suffering? The Ninth Symphony, with its Ode to Joy, was composed when he was completely deaf, isolated, ill, and bitter. Is it possible that pain not only accompanied his genius but fueled it? And if so, what does that say about our celebration of these works? We are admiring not just art, but monuments to human suffering. The image expands. Other faces emerge from history. Virginia Woolf, who struggled her entire life with what we would now call bipolar disorder. Ernest Hemingway, whose depression ended in suicide. Sylvia Plath, who put her head in an oven at 30. Frida Kahlo, trapped in a body shattered by a streetcar accident. Alan Turing, the mathematical genius who saved millions of lives by deciphering Nazi codes, but was chemically castrated for his homosexuality and died of poisoning. The list is long, dark, and raises unsettling questions. Do we celebrate these people or their corpses? Their achievements or their sacrifices? But to understand this truth, we must begin with perhaps the purest example of a tortured genius. A man whose name is synonymous with artistic madness. A painter who sold only one work during his lifetime, who cut off part of his ear, who ended his days in an asylum, and who shot himself in the chest in a wheat field. Vincent van Gogh is not just a story of misunderstood art. He is a story of untreated mental illness, of spirit-crushing poverty, of a family system that kept him alive but also emotionally crushed him. And it is there, in the fields of southern France where he painted impossible yellow sunflowers, that we will truly begin to unravel the hidden price of immortality. France, July 1890. A gunshot shatters the silence of a wheat field under the blazing sun. Vincent van Gogh walks back to the inn where he is staying, a bullet wound in his abdomen. He doesn't call for immediate help. He doesn't scream. He climbs the stairs to his room as if nothing had happened. He will die 2 days later in the arms of his brother Theo, who has supported Vincent financially and emotionally for years. His last words, "The sadness will last forever." But there is something we don't know about that gunshot. Something that recent research has called into question. Did Vincent van Gogh really commit suicide? Or was he the victim of something more sinister? The answer will reveal not only the end of his life, but the nature of his torment. We return to that wheat field. Oversures, July 27, 1890. For more than a century, the official narrative was clear: Van Gogh committed suicide. But in 2011, biographers Stephen Nafee and Gregory White Smith presented disturbing evidence. The bullet's trajectory was odd. It entered at an angle that made self-inflicted wounds difficult to believe. Van Gogh left no suicide note, unusual for someone who wrote constantly. There was no gun at the scene. And witnesses saw 2 local teenagers who frequently harassed Van Gogh that day, one of whom had a faulty weapon. The alternative theory: Vincent was accidentally or intentionally wounded, and by protecting the boys, he let everyone believe it was suicide. Dying while protecting those who tormented him. That is profoundly Van Gogh. But let's go back a few years to understand why Vincent might have chosen that narrative. His relationship with his younger brother Theo was both his anchor and his shackles. Theo, an employee at an art gallery in Paris, sent Vincent money every month. Without that help, Vincent couldn't paint, eat, or live. The letters between the brothers, more than 650 survive, reveal the dynamic. Vincent constantly asks for more money, more materials. Theo responds patiently, but also with barely contained frustration. Vincent knows he is a burden. In a letter from 1889, he writes, "My own life is weakened at the root, my steps also falter." The guilt of depending on Theo gnaws at him. And when Theo has a son in 1890, Vincent understands that his brother now has other priorities. Was that what drew him to that field? To understand Vincent's pain, we must return to its origin. Zundert, Netherlands, March 30, 1853. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born, but this was not a day of pure celebration. Exactly 1 year earlier, on the same day, another baby had been born into this family, also named Vincent Willem van Gogh. That first Vincent died at birth. The painter we know was literally a replacement. Every birthday, the family visited a grave bearing his name. Modern psychologists identify this as replacement child syndrome. Growing up in the shadow of a deceased sibling generates deep feelings of never being enough, of existing only to fill a void. Vincent carried that mark throughout his life. Vincent didn't start out as an artist. His first dream was to follow in his father's footsteps, to be a Protestant pastor. At 25, he worked as a lay missionary in the Borinage, Belgium, a brutally poor mining region. Vincent took his vocation too literally. He gave away all his clothes and slept on the floor to live like the poor. The church considered him a fanatic and dismissed him. It was a devastating failure. Vincent interpreted this as divine rejection. If God didn't want him, what value did his life have? This pattern would repeat itself. Vincent would give himself completely to something, do so with self-destructive intensity, and be rejected. It would happen with his artistic career, with his love affairs, with every attempt to belong. 1880. Vincent is 27 years old and has achieved nothing. So he decides, almost by elimination, to become an artist. It's not a romantic notion, it's a last resort. He writes to Theo, "Let me be myself, and then I'll be satisfied." But Vincent has no formal training. His technique is rough, his colors strange. Art academies reject him. Even his cousin, the respected painter Anton Mauve, ends up throwing him out of his studio after a fit of Vincent's temper. But Vincent has something that will compensate for his lack of technique, an almost superhuman capacity for work. He paints compulsively, frenetically, producing work after work. Between 1888 and 1890, he creates more than 800 paintings. It's a frenetic output that hides a dark truth. Vincent doesn't paint for the love of art. He paints to justify his existence. But as he paints, something else is growing inside him. Strange episodes that terrify those around him. Als, France, 1888. Vincent has convinced Paul Gauguin to live and paint with him in the Yellow House. Living together is a disaster. Vincent experiences violent mood swings, manic euphoria followed by abysmal depression. He drinks absinthe excessively. In December, during an argument, Vincent threatens Gauguin with a razor. That night, in a psychotic state, Vincent cuts off part of his left ear and gives it, wrapped up, to a local prostitute. He is hospitalized. Modern diagnoses suggest several possibilities: bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, or acute intermittent porphyria. We will never know for sure. But what we do know is that Vincent lived through these episodes without understanding them, without treatment, believing he was simply going mad. May 1889. Vincent makes an extraordinary decision. He voluntarily admits himself to the St. Paul de Massol Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. His room has bars on the window. He can hear the screams of other patients. But curiously, this period of confinement is one of the most productive of his life. He paints The Starry Night, one of the most iconic works of Western art. Those celestial swirls are not just imagination. They are the vision of someone whose perception is neurologically altered. Vincent paints what his diseased brain shows him, and accidentally creates something transcendent. But the cost is brutal. He is aware of his deterioration. He writes to Theo, "The disease is turning me into an animal." He remains lucid enough to know that he is losing his mind, which is perhaps the cruelest torment of all. And there is another, rarely mentioned, physical suffering. Vincent was literally starving himself to buy paint. His letters to Theo are filled with pleas. He needs more canvases, more pigments, especially yellows and blues. But the money Theo sends isn't enough for both, food and materials. Vincent chooses the materials. He eats rotten potatoes, stale bread, little else. His health crumbles. His teeth fall out. He develops chronic stomach problems. He looks like a vagrant, thin, disheveled, smelling of turpentine and misery. The people of Als demand he be expelled from the town. They sign a petition calling him the Mad Redhead. Vincent paints golden sunflowers while his body withers away. The irony is brutal. He creates beauty while embodying devastation. Throughout his entire adult life, Vincent sold only one painting, Red Vineyard et al.'s, bought for 400 francs, equivalent to about $2,000 today, by Anna Bach in 1890. A single sale in a decade of obsessive work. Today, his works are worth hundreds of millions. Portrait of Dr. Gachet, sold in 1990 for $82.5 million. Vincent died thinking he had completely failed as an artist. He died without knowing he would become one of the most beloved painters in history. That ignorance of his own future legacy is another form of tragedy. He never received the consolation of knowing that his suffering would produce something valuable. He died believing it had all been in vain. But there is one last dark twist to this story. Theo van Gogh, the brother who supported Vincent for years, died 6 months after Vincent. He was only 33. Doctors diagnosed paralytic dementia caused by syphilis, but those who knew him knew the truth. Theo died of grief. Vincent's death shattered him. He stopped eating, stopped working, and suffered a complete nervous breakdown. The brothers are buried side by side in Auvers, their graves covered in intertwined ivy. Theo sacrificed his financial stability, his sanity, and ultimately his life for Vincent's art. But history remembers them unevenly. Everyone knows Vincent, few remember Theo. This asymmetry raises an uncomfortable question. How many anonymous people destroyed themselves supporting the geniuses we remember? How many Theos are behind every Vincent? England, March 28, 1941. Virginia Woolf walks toward the River Ouse near her home in Sussex. She wears her fur coat, her pockets filled with stones. She has left 2 letters, one for her husband, Leonard, the other for her sister, Vanessa. In them, she writes, "I am sure I am going mad again." She wades into the cold water and lets herself sink. Her body will not be found until 3 weeks later. Virginia Woolf, one of the most innovative writers of the 20th century, author of Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, ends her life at the age of 59 in the same way she had contemplated it for decades. But her suicide was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of a lifelong battle with a mental illness that alternately lifted her to impossible creative heights and plunged her into abysses of unspeakable suffering. Virginia experienced her first nervous breakdown at age 13, following her mother's death. The second came at 24, after her father's passing. The symptoms were terrifying: auditory hallucinations in which she heard birds singing in Greek, periods of mutism where she couldn't speak for days, violent food refusal that left her weighing less than 90 pounds, and suicide attempts, including one where she threw herself out of a window. Doctors of the time diagnosed her with neurasthenia, a vague term that explained nothing. Today we would recognize bipolar disorder with psychotic episodes. But in Edwardian England, the treatment consisted of rest cure, confinement to bed, forced overfeeding, and an absolute prohibition against reading or writing. For a woman whose identity was intertwined with literature, this was torture. But Virginia discovered something extraordinary. When she was manic, her writing achieved superhuman clarity and originality. Mrs. Dalloway and The Waves were written during periods of controlled hypomania. Her famous narrative, Stream of Consciousness, that immersion in the inner thoughts of her characters, was partly a literary representation of how her own disordered mind worked. Virginia didn't just write about consciousness, she transcribed her own, with all its chaotic leaps and strange associations. But this gift came at a price. After finishing each novel, she would fall into a severe depression. The pattern was predictable: months of feverish work, followed by total collapse. Her husband, Leonard, learned to recognize the signs. When Virginia started talking too fast, when she stopped sleeping, he knew the episode was coming. He tried to protect her, but how do you protect someone from their own mind? Virginia was not alone in her suffering. She was a member of the Bloomsbury Group, a London intellectual circle that included progressive writers, artists, and thinkers. But behind the facade of sophistication, many members grappled with hidden traumas. Her sister, Vanessa Bell, had attempted suicide. Lytton Strachey struggled with his homosexuality in an era when it was a crime. Dora Carrington, a painter in the group, committed suicide at the age of 38. The group functioned as a refuge for brilliant and broken people, but also as an echo chamber where emotional instability was normalized and even romanticized. Virginia found understanding among them, but also confirmation of her worst fears, that extraordinary people are doomed to suffer. But there is one specific source of trauma that Virginia kept hidden until her later memoirs: childhood sexual abuse. Her half-brothers, George and Gerald Duckworth, sexually abused her from a young age. In her private diaries, published decades after her death, Virginia describes disturbing scenes: Gerald putting his hand under her clothes when she was 6, George entering her room at night when she was a teenager. This abuse was never publicly acknowledged during her lifetime. Virginia buried it, but it manifested itself in her work. Her novels are full of female characters who feel their bodies are prisons, who experience sexuality with horror or dissociation. Childhood trauma is a critical component of many mental illnesses, and Virginia's was deeply buried, poisoning her from within. But what finally drove Virginia to the river was World War II. London was being bombed. Her home in the city was destroyed. Refugees were crossing Europe. Virginia, who had lost friends in World War I, saw history repeating itself. In her last letters, she mentions hearing constant German bombers, the fear of a Nazi invasion. She also feared that her latest novel, Between the Acts, would be a failure. Her mental health was rapidly deteriorating. Leonard kept a constant watch over her, but on the morning of March 28, Virginia seized a moment of distraction. She wrote her farewell letters, remarkably calm and loving, and walked toward the river. What makes her suicide all the more tragic is that the war would be over in 4 years, and her literary reputation would explode. But Virginia couldn't see that future. She saw only endless darkness. The letter Virginia left for Leonard reads, "I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been." It is a note of genuine love, without reproach. She thanks Leonard for his patience during years of illness. But she also writes, "I know I am ruining your life." Therein lies the burden she carried, the belief that her very existence harmed those she loved. Suicides of people with mental illness often carry this distorted logic. They believe their death will bring relief to others. Leonard lived 28 years after Virginia, but he never remarried. He edited and published her journals, preserving her legacy. But in later interviews, his grief remained raw. Virginia's illness didn't just kill her, it permanently scarred those who loved her. Throughout her life, Virginia resisted formal medical diagnosis. Psychiatrists frightened her. She had been briefly institutionalized in a private sanatorium in 1910, and the experience traumatized her. Treatments at the time included morphine injections, confinement, and in extreme cases, lobotomy. Virginia knew that if she were officially declared insane, she would lose control over her life. That's why she kept her illness semi-hidden, treated only by sympathetic family doctors. This denial of the medical establishment was understandable but dangerous. Without proper treatment, which in any case didn't really exist in her time, Virginia relied solely on her willpower to stay alive. And eventually, that willpower gave out. The cruel irony is that Virginia Woolf is famous for her essay, A Room of One's Own, where she argues that women need economic independence and space to create. But Virginia herself never had true peace of mind, that inner space where creativity flows painlessly. Her room was constantly invaded by voices, fears, and traumatic memories. Writing was not a pleasure for her. It was an act of existential resistance. Each book was an argument for her own life. And when she felt she could no longer write another, that her mind was too broken, She lost her reason to continue. For Virginia, creativity and survival were inseparable. When one died, the other followed. Virginia's body was cremated. Her ashes were buried under a tree in the garden of her Sussex home. There was no public funeral. Leonard wanted to keep it private. But Virginia's death left a question that haunts all who admire her work. Would she have written so brilliantly without her mental illness? Her novels capture the fragility of consciousness, the way the self constantly dissolves and reforms. Could someone mentally stable grasp that so profoundly? And if the answer is no, what are the moral implications? Should we be grateful for her suffering because it produced great literature? The question is obscene, but unavoidable. And it brings us to another figure who faced the same demon, an American writer whose exaggerated masculinity masked a mortal fragility. Ketchum, Idaho. July 2, 1961. Dawn breaks over the Sawtooth Mountains. Ernest Hemingway descends the stairs of his house. His wife, Mary, is asleep upstairs. Ernest goes to the basement, selects a double-barreled shotgun, loads it with 12-gauge shotgun shells, puts the barrel in his mouth and fires. Mary finds his body. Death is instantaneous. Ernest Hemingway, Nobel Prize winner, author of The Old Man and the Sea and For Whom the Bell Tolls, an icon of American masculinity, commits suicide at the age of 61. Officially, his death is ruled accidental. But no one shoots themselves in the mouth accidentally. The truth is that Ernest had attempted suicide multiple times in the preceding months. He had been hospitalized, given electroshock therapy, and constantly monitored. Nothing worked. Because Ernest's problem wasn't just depression. It was something deeper, older, and related to an identity built on lies. Ernest Hemingway cultivated a very specific public image: hunter, deep-sea fisherman, war correspondent, drinker, friend of bullfighters. His photographs show him with safari rifles, holding giant marlins, in trenches during the Spanish Civil War. He wrote in short, direct sentences, devoid of sentimentality. He created the archetype of the tough writer. But this was a mask. The person behind it was insecure, paranoid, emotionally fragile. Ernest constantly needed to prove his masculinity because internally he doubted it. His 4 marriages ended in part because of his need for constant conquest and his incapacity for emotional intimacy. He collected extreme experiences, bullfighting, big game hunting, combat, as evidence that he was a real man. But each feat only temporarily relieved his anxiety. The question that haunted him was never answered: am I man enough? To understand this obsession, we must return to Oak Park, Illinois, at the beginning of the 20th century. Ernest's mother, Grace, was a domineering woman with frustrated artistic ambitions. She behaved strangely with Ernest and his older sister, Marceline. She dressed them identically in girls' clothing until they were 6 years old. She called Ernest the Dutch baby and styled his hair in feminine curls. Psychologists have speculated that this created gender identity confusion in Ernest. His father, Clarence, was a doctor and hunter, but he also suffered from severe depression. Ernest grew up in a home where masculinity was simultaneously demanded and undermined. The result was a boy who would spend his entire life overcompensating, playing an exaggerated macho role to drown out any inner doubt. Italy, 1918. Ernest is 18 years old and an ambulance driver in the First World War. He isn't a soldier. He was rejected for poor eyesight, but he's close to the front lines. On July 8th, while distributing chocolate to Italian soldiers, an Austrian mortar explodes nearby. Shrapnel pierces his legs. More than 220 metal fragments are embedded in his body. Despite his injuries, according to the myth Ernest would later recount, he carries a wounded Italian soldier to safety, taking more bullets in the process. He is awarded a medal for valor. But later research questions this version. Ernest likely exaggerated his heroism. What is undeniable is that the injuries were real and traumatic. He spent months recovering. And something else happened in that hospital. He fell in love with an American nurse, Agnes von Kurowski, who rejected him. Both experiences, physical and romantic, would forever mark his writing. 1920. Ernest is in Paris, establishing himself as a writer. He receives a telegram from Oak Park. His father has committed suicide with a gunshot. Clarence Hemingway had struggled for years with diabetes and depression. Finally, he used the Civil War revolver that had belonged to his own father. Ernest is devastated, but also terrified. Suicide is hereditary, not genetically, but as a learned pattern. Ernest now knows that this path runs in his family. Decades later, when his own depression becomes unbearable, he will remember his father's pistol. And the similarity will be chilling. Ernest, too, chose a firearm. He, too, waited until his wife could no longer stop him. Suicide was passed down from generation to generation. In fact, Ernest's sister, Ursula, would commit suicide in 1966. His brother, Lester, in 1982. His granddaughter, Margot, in 1996. But before his final suicide, Ernest's body accumulated a history of injuries that seemed almost deliberately self-destructive. He was wounded in 2 wars. He survived 2 plane crashes in Africa in 1954 that left him with severe concussions, burns, and damage to his kidneys and spine. He suffered multiple concussions from car accidents. He fractured his skull in Paris when a skylight fell on him. He suffered from amoebic dysentery in Africa, malaria, pneumonia, and liver problems from decades of alcoholism. By 1960, his body was broken. He needed help to dress. He suffered from chronic pain. But more devastating was the neurological damage. The repeated concussions had affected his memory and concentration. Ernest, who had won the Nobel Prize for his precise prose, could no longer write coherently. His identity as a writer, the only thing that justified his existence, was dying. 1960. Ernest develops intense paranoia. He believes the FBI is watching him, that his phones are tapped, that agents are following him. His friends dismiss it as delusion. But Ernest was right. Files declassified in 1983 revealed that J. Edgar Hoover had ordered surveillance of Hemingway for years, suspecting communist connections because of his time in Cuba. Ernest's paranoia was partly real. But this brought him no relief. It plunged him deeper. He stopped trusting everyone. He stopped eating, fearing his food was poisoned. He lost weight drastically. His doctor admitted him to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, under a false name. The diagnosis, severe depression. The treatment, electroconvulsive therapy. Ernest received more than 20 electroshock sessions during 2 separate hospitalizations. The procedure in the 1960s was brutal. Electric current sent to the brain to induce seizures. Proponents argued that it rebooted the depressed brain. Side effects included severe memory loss, confusion, and permanent cognitive damage. For Ernest, it was a catastrophe. After the treatment, he couldn't recall any events from his life. "What's the point of ruining my head and erasing my memory, which is my capital?" he asked his doctor. For a writer whose work depended on memory, electroshock was equivalent to destroying a surgeon's tools. Ernest knew he was finished. He put it bluntly, "This brilliant therapy has erased all my memory." In June 1961, he was discharged. A month later, he was dead. Before his successful suicide, Ernest had attempted it at least twice. En route to the Mayo Clinic, he tried to walk into the propellers of a moving airplane. His escort stopped him. Weeks later, at home, he tried to shoot his wife and then himself. His doctor hid all the guns. But Ernest was determined. On the morning of July 2nd, he convinced Mary that he wanted to clean his favorite shotgun. Mary, exhausted from months of vigilance, agreed. Ernest went downstairs. The shotgun was loaded. It had always been loaded. Some biographers suggest that Mary, consciously or unconsciously, allowed it to happen. That after months of watching her husband suffer, she stopped interfering. We will never know. But what we do know is that Ernest waited for a moment of solitude to do what he had planned for months. Ernest Hemingway's death was officially ruled an accident until Mary cleared the truth years later. But there's an additional dimension that's rarely discussed. Ernest had severe hypertension, hemochromatosis, an iron overload that damages organs, diabetes, and possibly chronic traumatic brain injury from all his concussions. Essentially, his brain was physically damaged. His depression wasn't just psychological, it had neurological and metabolic components. Combined with the damage from electroshock, Ernest was struggling with a dysfunctional organ. He wasn't simply mentally weak. His brain was broken at a physical level. This distinction matters because it reframes his suicide. It wasn't a free choice, but the result of an untreated organic disease. And this leads us to wonder, how many other romantic suicides of artists were actually symptoms of physical brain diseases that the medicine of their time couldn't detect or treat? London, February 11, 1963. It is the most brutal winter England has seen in decades. Sub-zero temperatures, frozen pipes, blackouts. Sylvia Plath is alone in her apartment with her 2 young children, Frida, 2, and Nicholas, 1. Her husband, the poet Ted Hughes, left her months ago for another woman. Sylvia has been writing frantically for weeks, producing some of her finest poems. But this morning, around 4 a.m., Sylvia seals her children's bedroom door with wet towels, places their heads on pillows, and leaves milk and bread nearby. She goes down to the kitchen, turns on the gas in the oven, puts her head inside, and inhales deeply. She is found hours later. She is 30 years old. She will never know that those last poems, posthumously compiled as Ariel, will make her one of the most powerful voices in 20th century poetry. But let's rewind to a very different Sylvia. Massachusetts, the 1950s. Sylvia Plath is the perfect student, impeccable grades, publications in prestigious magazines since her teens, a scholarship to Smith College. Blonde, pretty, smiling in photographs. She wins poetry contests. She works as a guest editor at Mademoiselle magazine. From the outside, she is the epitome of post-war American success. But her private diaries, published after her death, reveal a terrifying reality. Every achievement leaves her empty. She writes, "I can never be happy with what I have. I always want more." She describes a layer of glass that separates her from the world. She constantly feels like an imposter. And there is crushing pressure. She must be perfect at everything. Perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect poet. Perfection is her prison. August 1953. Sylvia is 20. She's been rejected from a writing course at Harvard, her first significant academic failure. She falls into a deep depression. One night, she takes her mother's bottle of sleeping pills, writes a note saying, "I've gone for a long walk," and hides in the crawl space under her house. She swallows the pills, intending not to wake up. But her body is found 3 days later. The note alerted her family. She's alive, barely. She's hospitalized in a psychiatric ward. She receives electroconvulsive therapy, but unlike Hemingway's brutal sessions decades later, Sylvia's are more precisely calibrated. They help temporarily. Sylvia returns to Smith, finishes her degree, wins a Fulbright scholarship to Cambridge. Superficially, she recovers. But the suicidal impulse never left. It just lay dormant, waiting. To understand Sylvia's grief, we must know Otto Plath, her father. He was a professor of entomology and a bee specialist. Sylvia adored him. But when she was 8, Otto died from complications of diabetes that he himself hadn't properly treated. He mistook his symptoms for cancer and refused to see doctors. His death was, in part, a passive suicide. Sylvia never processed this trauma. In her most famous poem, Daddy, she writes, "Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm done." The poem is an explosion of rage, confusion, and distorted love for a dead father. Sylvia spent her life searching for replacements for Otto, older men, authority figures, and eventually Ted Hughes, who possessed the same dark intensity that Sylvia associated with her father. But no replacement worked because what Sylvia truly needed was to process the grief of an 8-year-old girl who never understood why her father abandoned her. Cambridge, 1956. Sylvia meets Ted Hughes at a party. The attraction is instant and intense. Ted kisses her so hard he leaves a mark. Sylvia writes in her diary that she has found her perfect man. They marry 4 months later. On the surface, they are the ideal literary couple, two talented young poets. But the dynamic is destructive from the start. Sylvia types Ted's manuscripts, submits his poems to competitions, manages his career. When Ted gains recognition first, Sylvia is publicly pleased but seethes with jealousy in private. Her own literary ambition, which is fierce, must be subordinated to Ted's success. It is the 1950s. Women are expected to be subservient wives. But Sylvia is not subservient. She is a volcano. And the pressure mounts. 1960. Sylvia gives birth to Frida. A year later, Nicholas is born. Sylvia loves her children but also resents them. Writing with 2 young children is nearly impossible. She gets up at 4 in the morning to steal hours of writing before they wake up. She describes motherhood as the walls closing in. She is physically exhausted. She develops appendicitis, sinusitis, and suffers a miscarriage. Ted travels frequently, leaving her alone. And then she discovers the infidelity. Ted is having an affair with Asha Wevel, a married woman. Sylvia confronts Ted. The relationship implodes. Ted leaves. Sylvia is left alone in a rented house in Devon, short of money, with 2 children, in the middle of winter. It is 1962. Divorce is stigmatized. Sylvia is now a single mother, a social failure. Her world is crumbling. But something extraordinary happens in those final months. Sylvia writes with a ferocity she had never before displayed. Between October 1962 and her death in February 1963, she produces more than 40 poems. They are dark, furious, brilliant. Lady Lazarus, where she compares her resurrection from suicide attempts to a circus act. Ariel, a wild ride toward the dissolution of the self. Daddy, her explosive confrontation with the paternal figure. These poems are masterpieces, but they are also cries for help. Sylvia is documenting her own disintegration in real time. The poems are simultaneously her greatest artistic achievement and evidence of her mental breakdown. She is cannibalizing her own pain to create art. And the process is killing her. Sylvia knew she was in danger. Days before her death, she contacted her psychiatrist, Dr. John Horder. She described her suicidal thoughts to him. The doctor promised to visit her and arrange a bed for her in a psychiatric hospital. But there was a delay. The British healthcare system was overwhelmed. The admission date was set for February 12th. Sylvia died on the 11th. 1 day later, Dr. Horder expressed deep guilt. But the reality is that the system failed. Sylvia had explicitly asked for help, and it didn't arrive in time. Furthermore, she was taking antidepressants, iproniazid, which in rare cases can worsen suicidal thoughts before improving mood. Sylvia could have been in that critical period where she had enough energy to act on her despair. It's a tragedy of timing. The method Sylvia chose, oven gas, was common in England at the time because domestic gas contained carbon monoxide. It was relatively quick and painless. But the detail that haunts everyone is how Sylvia protected her children. She sealed their room, left food nearby. Her last act was maternal. She wanted to die but not harm her babies. However, her death would mark them permanently. Frida Hughes became a painter and poet, grappling with her mother's legacy her entire life. Nicholas Hughes became a marine biologist. He struggled with depression. In 2009, at the age of 47, Nicholas hanged himself in Alaska. Suicide, once again, spanning generations. Sylvia's mental illness didn't die with her, it infected her son. But Sylvia's death began another dark chapter, a battle over her legacy. Ted Hughes became Sylvia's literary executor. He published Ariel, but edited the manuscript, removing some poems and adding others, changing the order Sylvia had planned. Sylvia's fans accused him of censoring her voice, of protecting his own image. There were protests. Ted's name was repeatedly chiseled from Sylvia's gravestone. Ted argued that he was protecting his children from the darker poems about their marriage. Both sides have valid points. But the war reveals something unsettling. Even in death, Sylvia could not escape control. Her most personal work became a battleground. And the question arises, can art survive independently of the artist? Or will it always be tainted by the circumstances of its creation? In Sylvia's case, her suicide almost overshadows her poetry. She is remembered as much for how she died as for what she wrote. And that, perhaps, is another kind of tragedy. Wilmslow, England. June 8, 1954. Alan Turing, 41, is found dead in his bed. Beside him lies a half-eaten apple. The autopsy reveals cyanide. The official conclusion, suicide. The image of the poisoned apple, like Snow White, becomes iconic. But there is mystery. Turing had been working with chemicals containing cyanide for electroplating experiments. Was it really suicide or an accident? His mother insisted throughout her life that it was accidental. But those who knew Turing knew he had reasons to want to die. 2 years earlier, the British government, the same government for which he had won the war, arrested, tried, and chemically castrated him for the crime of being homosexual. Alan Turing saved millions of lives by deciphering the Nazi Enigma code. His reward was persecution, humiliation, and systematic destruction. This is the story of how a nation devours its heroes. We go back to 1939. World War II. The Nazis are using the Enigma machine to encrypt military communications. England is losing. Without deciphering the German messages, the war seems impossible to win. Enter Alan Turing, a brilliant mathematician from Cambridge. He is assigned to Bletchley Park, the secret British cryptography center. Turing designs the Bomba, an electromechanical machine that can test thousands of Enigma configurations per minute. It is the conceptual grandfather of modern computers. The work of Turing and his team deciphers messages that allow the Allies to anticipate German submarine attacks, change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, and hasten the end of the war. Estimates suggest that their work shortened the war by 2 years and saved 14 million lives. Turing is, without exaggeration, one of the most important heroes of the 20th century. But throughout this time, Turing carries another secret besides the Enigma code. He is gay. In 1940s England, homosexuality is a crime under the gross indecency laws. It can result in imprisonment. Turing knows this and hides it, but not perfectly. At Bletchley Park, his colleagues notice his lack of interest in women, his intensity with certain young men. There are rumors. But during the war, the authorities turn a blind eye. Turing is too valuable. The strategy is implicit. As long as you win the war, we will ignore who you are. But this conditional tolerance will disappear when the conflict ends. And Turing, who has lived for years under extreme pressure maintaining state secrets, develops a dangerous psychology. He believes he can keep any secret indefinitely. He cannot. January 1952. Turing, now famous in academic circles though his wartime work remains classified, meets Arnold Murray, a 19-year-old unemployed man, outside a cinema in Manchester. They begin a relationship. Weeks later, Turing's apartment is burglarized. Murray confesses that a friend of his, an acquaintance of Murray's, was the thief. Turing reports the burglary to the police. During the investigation, detectives uncover the nature of the relationship between Turing and Murray. Both are arrested for gross indecency. Turing denies nothing. In fact, he seems almost relieved to finally be able to speak openly. But it is a catastrophic confession. The man who kept the most important secrets of the war cannot keep his own. The trial is brief. Turing pleads guilty. He doesn't see that he did anything morally wrong, but he acknowledges that he broke the law. The judge offers him two options: prison or treatment with synthetic female hormones to suppress his libido. The choice is spurious, not really a choice. Prison would mean the end of his scientific career. Turing chooses the hormones. For a year, he receives regular injections of diethylstilbestrol, DES, a synthetic estrogen. The effects are devastating. He develops gynecomastia, breast growth, impotence, severe mood swings, and depression. His body is being chemically altered against his will. It is chemical castration. To call it treatment is obscene. It is medical torture sanctified by the state. And all because he loved another man. But the hormones are only part of his punishment. Turing loses his security clearance. He can no longer work on government projects. The man who was essential to winning the war is now considered a security risk because his homosexuality supposedly makes him vulnerable to blackmail. The logic is twisted. The only reason Turing would be vulnerable is because the state itself has criminalized his identity. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Furthermore, Turing can no longer travel freely. His passport is confiscated when he tries to travel to Greece. The authorities fear he will flee the country. The man who saved his nation is treated as a prisoner within it. And his colleagues, many of whom know his historical significance, remain silent. No one publicly speaks out in his defense. The stigma is too great. 1954. Turing has finished his hormone treatment, but the psychological effects linger. He suffers from depression. Nevertheless, he continues working. He is exploring morphogenesis, how biological patterns emerge mathematically. His friends notice changes. He is more withdrawn, sometimes incoherent. On June 7th, they have dinner with him. He seems no different than usual. The next day, his housekeeper finds him dead. The investigation is swift. The apple by his bed, never tested for cyanide, incidentally, becomes the evidence. The verdict is suicide. The funeral is small. No government representative attends. The man who saved England dies like a criminal. His death is barely reported. Most Britons will never know who he was or what he did until decades later. Turing's work at Bletchley Park remained classified until the 1970s. For decades, neither he nor his colleagues could speak about their most important contributions. Turing died without public recognition. His story was unknown. And when it was finally declassified, an uncomfortable question arose. How many other Alan Turings were destroyed by the anti-homosexuality laws of the time? How many potential geniuses were lost because the state criminalized their identity? Between 1945 and 1955, more than 40,000 men were arrested in England for homosexual offenses. Many lost careers, families, lives. Some committed suicide. Their names are in police files, forgotten. Turing is remembered only because his genius was so extraordinary that it could not be completely erased. But the others disappeared. 2009, the British government, under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, issued an official apology to Alan Turing. Brown wrote, "On behalf of the British government, and all those who live free because of Alan's work, I am very proud to say, sorry, you deserved so much better." It was a powerful statement. But Turing had been dead for 55 years. 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. Again, a significant but belated gesture. The question is, what good are apologies if they don't bring back lives? Turing couldn't enjoy his vindication. He couldn't see that he had become an icon of the LGBT movement, that his story had educated millions about the injustices of anti-gay laws. He died believing he had let his country down. The truth came too late. There's a strange epilogue. The Apple Incorporated logo, an apple with a bite taken out of it, has led to speculation that it's a tribute to Alan Turing. Steve Jobs denied this, saying it was a coincidence. But the original designer, Rob Janoff, never confirmed nor denied the connection. The ambiguity is appropriate, because Turing is the conceptual father of the modern computer. Every digital device we use has its theoretical roots in Turing's work. You're reading this, whether on screen or paper, thanks to concepts Turing developed. Yet his name remained unknown for generations. Only recently has his story gone mainstream, thanks in part to the 2014 film, The Imitation Game. But even now, his torture is often secondary in the narratives. The focus is on his genius, not his suffering. And that brings us to a central question. Should we separate the achievement from the pain that produced it? Or more profoundly, is it even possible? Mexico City, September 17, 1925. 18-year-old Frida Kahlo is riding a bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias. It's an ordinary day. Until it isn't. The bus collides with an electric streetcar. The impact is catastrophic. An iron bar pierces Frida's pelvis, entering through her left hip and exiting through her vagina. Her spine is fractured in 3 places. Her right leg suffers 11 fractures. Her right foot is crushed. Her collarbone is broken. A rib is punctured. Witnesses recall a surreal image. Frida's body is covered in gold dust from a torn package of gold leaf carried by another passenger. She looks like a shattered statue. The doctors don't expect her to survive. But Frida does. And she will spend the rest of her life, 30 more years, living in that broken body, painting the pain that will never leave her. Frida Kahlo did not become an artist despite her suffering. He became an artist because suffering was the only thing he was guaranteed. Frida spends months in bed, immobilized in a plaster cast that covers her torso. Her body is a cage. To combat boredom and despair, her mother installs a mirror on the canopy of her bed. Frida can see herself, and she begins to paint self-portraits. Not because she is narcissistic, but because she is the only constant model available. I paint self-portraits because I am alone so much, she will later say. I paint myself because I am the person I know best. But there is something deeper. Frida is documenting the disintegration of her body. Each self-portrait is an act of resistance against the death that almost claims her. If she can paint herself, she can prove that she still exists. Art becomes her anchor to life. 1929. Frida, now an emerging artist, marries Diego Rivera, Mexico's most famous muralist. Diego is 42, Frida 22. He weighs over 285 pounds, she less than 100. Frida's mother describes the union as an elephant marrying a dove. But Frida is deeply in love. Diego represents vitality, artistic genius, and a connection to the art world that Frida craves. However, Diego is a compulsive womanizer. He has affairs constantly, even with Frida's younger sister, Cristina. Each infidelity devastates Frida, but she cannot leave him. Her dependence is not just emotional, it is existential. Diego gives her purpose, an identity as Rivera's wife. Without him, she fears she is nothing. What Frida most desires is to have a child. But her shattered body won't cooperate. The streetcar accident irreparably damaged her pelvis and uterus. She becomes pregnant at least 3 times. All end in miscarriages or necessary therapeutic abortions because her body cannot sustain a pregnancy. In 1932, in Detroit, Frida suffers a devastating miscarriage at 3 months of gestation. She is bleeding profusely. She paints Henry Ford Hospital, one of her most disturbing works. Frida lies naked in a hospital bed, floating in a sea of blood, holding red ribbons connected to symbols of her loss. A fetus, a snail shell, pelvic bones. The pain is so visceral that viewing the painting is almost unbearable. But Frida cannot have children, so she paints her lost motherhood. It is the only thing she can do. The ordeal didn't end in 1925. It only began. During her lifetime, Frida endured more than 30 surgeries. Spinal fusions that failed. bone grafts that became infected, amputations of gangrenous toes. Her right leg, which never healed properly, grew shorter than her left. She wore special shoes but visibly limped. The pain was constant. Frida took opiate painkillers, drank excessively to numb the suffering. She developed a morphine addiction. Her diaries were filled with descriptions of pain. Why do they call it an illness if it's my way of life? But the cruelest thing was that each surgery promised relief and only delivered more pain. It was a cycle of hope and medical betrayal that lasted for decades. 1944. Frida paints The Broken Column, perhaps her most devastating self-portrait. She depicts herself with her torso open, revealing a fractured ionic column in place of a spine. Her body is pierced with nails. Tears stream down her face, but her expression is stoic. The painting is a literal representation of her condition. Her spine is collapsing, requiring increasingly restrictive steel corsets. The nails are the pain that pierces every inch of her body. But there is something extraordinary about the painting. Frida does not ask for pity. She looks directly at the viewer with defiance. She says, "This is my pain. Do not turn away from it. Look at it." It is a demand for witness. Frida transforms her suffering into artistic confrontation. 1953. Frida's right leg, a source of chronic pain for decades, develops gangrene. Doctors recommend amputation. Frida is devastated. In her diary, she writes, "Feet, what do I need them for if I have wings to fly?" It's an attempt to find meaning, but the trauma runs deep. The surgery is performed below the knee. Frida is fitted with a prosthetic leg made of red leather with embroidery and bells. She elaborately decorates it, turning it into an artistic statement. But in private, she is devastated. Her body image, already fractured, completely disintegrates. Her alcohol and drug use increases. Her friends notice a change. Frida's fighting spirit is fading. She is tired of battling. April 1954. Frida's first solo exhibition in Mexico finally takes place. But Frida is too ill to attend in the traditional way. So she orders her 4-poster bed to be transported to the gallery. She arrives by ambulance, is carried on a stretcher, and settles into her bed in the middle of the exhibition. She receives visitors lying down, surrounded by her paintings. It is simultaneously triumphant and tragic. Frida has transformed her disability into a final artistic performance. Her body, the source of her art, is on display as much as her paintings. The attendees don't know whether to applaud or weep. Frida smiles, toasts with tequila, sings revolutionary songs. But it's clear, she is dying. And she knows it. July 13, 1954. Frida dies in her blue house in Culiacan. The official cause is a pulmonary embolism. She is 47 years old. But there are suspicions that it was an intentional overdose. Her last diary entries are erratic, desperate. One reads, "I joyfully await the exit and hope never to return." Frida had attempted suicide at least once before, by cutting her wrists. Her physical pain was unbearable. Her emotional pain, Diego had had another affair, was just as devastating. Some biographers believe Frida administered a lethal dose of painkillers. Others insist it was a natural death. The truth will never be known. But perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that Frida spent 30 years slowly dying. Whether her end was active or passive, it was the inevitable result of decades of agony. After her death, Frida's reputation exploded. She became a feminist icon, a symbol of resistance, a representation of the female experience of pain. Her paintings sell for tens of millions. Her blue house is a museum. Her face is on t-shirts, mugs, murals. But there is something unsettling about this commercialization. Frida's pain has become aesthetic. Her self-portraits, documents of real trauma, are now decoration. People hang the two Fridas, where she paints her two selves, one loved and one rejected by Diego, in living rooms without reflecting on the origin of that image, a literally bleeding heart. We have turned Frida's suffering into merchandise. And this raises the question that haunts all these stories. Is it possible to honor these artists without fetishizing their pain? Can we admire art without romanticizing the agony that produced it? Frida painted her pain because she had no other choice. We hang it on walls because it's interesting. Isn't there something fundamentally disturbing about that? We return to the beginning. To those rooms where geniuses died, Freud's death-scented office, Van Gogh's blood-stained field, the river where Virginia drowned, Hemingway's splattered kitchen, Sylvia's bedroom filled with poison gas, Turing's room with the apple, Frida's bed drenched in pain. These are not isolated incidents. They are manifestations of a pattern that runs through the history of human genius. There is a documented correlation between exceptional creativity and extreme psychological suffering. But is suffering necessary for genius? Or is it simply that people with a certain neurological makeup produce both brilliant art and intensified pain? And more importantly, does it have to be this way? Modern studies shed disturbing light. Researchers at Stockholm University in 2011 examined the brains of highly creative people and found a lower density of dopamine D2 receptors in the thalamus, the same abnormality found in people with schizophrenia. This suggests that creative minds process information more chaotically, allowing them to make unusual connections but also making them vulnerable to distorted perception. A 2013 study from the Karolinska Institute found that writers have significantly higher rates of anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, unipolar depression, and substance abuse. The data are clear. Exceptional creativity and mental illness are neurologically intertwined. But this doesn't mean that suffering breeds genius. It means that certain brains are simultaneously blessed with creativity and cursed with vulnerability. But there's another complicating factor. For centuries, Western culture has romanticized the tortured artist. From the French cursed poets of the 19th century to the beat movement of the 20th, we've celebrated the idea that true art requires suffering. Suffering for your art became an aspirational standard. Young artists began to believe they had to destroy themselves to create something authentic. Alcohol, drugs, and emotional instability became markers of artistic seriousness. But this myth is poisonous, because it confuses correlation with causation. Many artists suffer, but they don't create because they suffer. They create in spite of the suffering. And many could have created more and lived happier lives with proper treatment. The romantic myth has killed artists by making them believe that seeking help would betray their art. But there is another narrative we rarely tell. Brilliant artists who received help, managed their mental illness, and lived long and productive lives. Alvin Ailey, the revolutionary choreographer, struggled with bipolar disorder, but with therapy and support, he created a dance company that endures. Carrie Fisher, the actress and writer, was open about her bipolar disorder and became a mental health advocate. Abigail Washburn, the musician, manages her depression with treatment and continues to create. These examples are important because they demonstrate that genius does not require destruction. It requires unusual minds, yes, but those minds can be supported, protected, and treated. The tragedy is that many of the geniuses we have explored lived in times when effective treatment didn't exist, or the stigma was so great that seeking it meant social destruction. Imagine for a moment what we would have gained if these artists had received modern help. If Van Gogh had had lithium for his likely bipolar disorder. If Virginia Woolf had had modern antipsychotics and cognitive behavioral therapy. If Hemingway hadn't been subjected to destructive electroshock therapy but to gentle treatment and psychotherapy. If Sylvia had had access to immediate hospitalization when she asked for it. If Alan Turing had lived in a society that didn't criminalize his identity. If Frida had had modern orthopedic surgeries and effective management of chronic pain. How much more art would they have created? How many more years of life? How much more happiness could they have experienced? The answer is devastating. probably decades more of creativity and some peace. We lost them too young, too broken. But we can't just blame primitive medicine or less enlightened times. There is collective responsibility. The societies that celebrated these geniuses after their deaths failed them while they were alive. Van Gogh died in poverty. Now his paintings are worth hundreds of millions. Turing was persecuted. Now he has monuments and posthumous apologies. Frida was exoticized and fetishized. Now she's a brand. There's a cruel pattern. We ignore or destroy geniuses when they're alive, then canonize them when they're dead. Their works increase in value precisely because they can no longer create. We have turned genius into a finite, exploitable resource. And this creates perverse incentives. The art of a suicidal artist is worth more than that of a living one. We are, inadvertently, rewarding self-destruction. And we must acknowledge that we only know these names because their genius was so extraordinary that it survived their destruction. But how many potential geniuses were completely erased? How many women like Virginia Woolf were permanently institutionalized and forgotten? How many men like Alan Turing were prosecuted and disappeared without leaving a legacy? How many painters like Frida Kahlo died before they could create their best work? The names we remember are the survivors. Those who managed, against impossible odds, to create enough work before being destroyed. But for every Van Gogh, there are dozens of equally talented artists whose mental illness, poverty, or persecution silenced them before they could contribute. We are seeing only the tip of the iceberg of lost talent. This brings us to the central question that has haunted this entire exploration. Should we be grateful for these artists' suffering because it produced great art? The answer must be a resounding no. Their art is valuable despite their suffering, not because of it. And if we could turn back the clock with modern medicine, compassionate therapy, and more just societies, we should, even if it meant their art would be different or less abundant. Because human life has intrinsic value beyond what it produces. Van Gogh deserved happiness more than we deserved his sunflowers. Virginia Woolf deserved peace of mind more than we deserved Mrs. Dalloway. Celebrating their art is fine. Fetishizing their pain is not. But there is hope in the present. Mental health is less stigmatized now than at any other point in history. Treatments, though imperfect, are infinitely better than they were 50 years ago. Contemporary artists speak openly about therapy, medication, and hospitalization. The conversation is changing. Organizations like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the Trevor Project provide resources. Suicide crisis numbers are available in many countries. In Mexico, Línea de la Vida offers support. In the United States, 988 is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. These support structures didn't exist for the geniuses we've explored. But they do now. And every life saved is one that can potentially create, love, contribute, and be happy. That's what we want, not less art, but more artists living well. We return to where we began, dark rooms where geniuses died. But now we understand that these deaths were not inevitable. They were not the necessary price of greatness. They were failures. Medical, social, personal failures. Failures of systems that did not value these people as human beings, only as producers of art. The price of immortality, perpetual fame, cultural legacy, should not be extreme suffering and early death. That is a deal we reject on behalf of all future artists. The true measure of a civilized society is not how many geniuses it produces, but how well it cares for them while they live. Because in the end, what we have learned from these hidden histories is simple yet profound. Greatness does not require destruction. Creativity does not need agony. And every brilliant mind we lose too soon is a tragedy we could, and should, prevent. Genius must flourish,